the announced end of the Russian aircraft Almirante Kuznetsov, a vessel that was born as a symbol of Soviet naval power, but over the years has become a dead weight for the Russian Navy. But before talking about the present and the reasons that lead Russia to finally give up this boat, we need to go back a few decades in time. And this trip begins shortly after the end of World War II. While the United States came out of conflict with an impressive fleet of aircraft carrier and already planned its expansion, the Soviet Union followed another way. Under the command of Joseph Stalin and then Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet priority were not big ships for power projection, but intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines. Khrushchev, in particular, via the aircraft carriers as floating targets, expensive, vulnerable, and unusual in the face of the advancement of nuclear weapons. Therefore, any aircraft carrier project that appeared on the clipboard was quickly shelved. The focus, then, became the coastal defense. The logic was simple: protecting the Soviet maritime borders and ensuring the safety of their underwater bases. During the 1960s, under Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Navy finally began experiencing larger vessels, but still far from being real aircraft. The first step was the construction of the Moskva-class helicopter ships that specialize in anti-submarine combat, equipped with Kamov Ka-25 helicopters. The next decade brought a bold evolution: the Kiev class. 4 hybrid ships, half carrier, half a missile cruiser were built. Kiev, Minsk, Novosibirsk, and Baku. These vessels were unique in the world, carrying vertical landing and takeoff aircraft, such as the Yak-38, as well as long-range anti-village missiles. The concept was strange, but it made sense to the Soviet strategy. It was not about attacking ports and distant cities, but of protecting the rear and keeping the enemy away from the country's sensitive areas. Even so, there was a growing feeling inside the Navy. To compete with NATO, it would be necessary to take a step further. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, leader of the Soviet Navy, dreamed loudly. He wanted a fleet that could operate globally, equally to the Americans. And it was from this ambition that the project of a real aircraft carrier was born, although still adapted to the Soviet mindset. In the 1980s, this dream began to take shape. But it was not about copying the American model. Instead of an aircraft carrier focused on offensive projection, the plan was to create a heavy cruiser, a legal definition that allowed the restrictions of the Montreux Treaty, which limited the passage of the aircraft carrier through the Bosphorus. The main mission would not be to attack, but to protect fleets from nuclear submarines and defend naval airspace against enemies. The shipyard chosen for the construction was Mykolaiv in Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. And so, in 1982, the works that would give rise to Admiral Kuznetsov began. But this story has begun with twists. The ship has changed its name several times: Riga, Leonid Brezhnev, Tbilisi, until finally received the name in honor of Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov. 3 years later, in 1985, he was released into the sea. But its official commissioning only happened in January 1991, a few months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the apex of a dream, and at the same time, the beginning of a problem that Russia would carry for more than 3 decades. When Admiral Kuznetsov was finally in service, impressed on paper, with a displacement of about 65,000 tons and just over 300 meters in length, it was undoubtedly the largest warship ever built by the Soviet Union. Its propulsion came from 8 boilers and 4 steam turbines, generating over 200,000 horsepower, enough to reach 29 knots, or about 54 kilometers per hour. But there was a crucial detail. Unlike U.S. aircraft carrier, Kuznetsov was not nuclear. The decision to use conventional propulsion, fueled with heavy fuel oil, the so-called mazut, was taken to save money. But this economy brought problems. Fuel produced dense black smoke when the engine was not in tune, something that would become a trademark of the ship, and also a joke between foreign sea. On board, it could carry up to 50 aircraft, including Sukhoi Su-33, MiG-29K, and helicopters. The takeoffs were made through a 12-degree scump in the bow, as the ship had no catapults. This solution significantly limited the fuel load and weaponry that planes could lead, affecting the scope and autonomy of the missions. Another striking feature of Kuznetsov was his own weaponry. Following the Soviet doctrine, it didn't just depend on planes to defend or attack. It was equipped with 12 anti-700 Granite anti-endorse missiles, as well as anti-aircraft and point defense systems. This reinforced his classification as heavy cruiser aircraft carrier, something that did not exist in Western vocabulary. Despite its grandeur, the ship operated little. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia faced financial difficulties and had no resources to keep Kuznetsov on the high sea regularly. Still, he participated in some missions, the most significant being in Syria in 2016. The operation, however, ended up staining his reputation further. Technical failures led to the loss of 2 aircraft, and images of the ship releasing smoke columns viralizing the world. Because of its recurring propulsion problems, the Kuznetsov always sailed accompanied by an ocean tug, ready to intervene if the engine failed. This preventive measure, although practical, eventually became a source of international marketing, reinforcing the image of a problematic aircraft carrier. In 2017, the decision was made. The ship would enter a dry dock for a major renovation and modernization. The initial plan was simple and direct: 3 years of work to update their systems, improve propulsion, and prolong their useful life for at least 20 years. But as so many times in Kuznetsov's history, which started as a promise became a headache. In 2018, during a floating dock flood, a crane fell on the deck, causing significant damage. The following year, a fire during repairs killed 2 workers and left injured. And in 2022, a new fire hit internal areas, killing more crew and further delaying the works. The cost began to fire. What would be a relatively rapid renovation began to consume billions of rubles, with no forecast of completion. Meanwhile, naval technology advanced, making Kuznetsov increasingly obsolete, even if it returned to the sea. At the extent that the years passed and the works dragged itself, the situation of Admiral Kuznetsov became unsustainable. The cost of keeping him standing, coupled with increasing spending on reform, began to weigh as an increasing burden for the Russian Navy. The invasion of Ukraine, which began in 2022, aggravated the scenario. Much of the defense resources was diverted to support land operations and compensate for the losses suffered in the conflict. In this context, sources near the High Naval Command began to admit the inevitable: Kuznetsov could never return to sea. And it was not just a matter of money. There was a problem of strategic relevance. The world had changed, and the Russian naval doctrine as well. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union still dreamed of the possibility of disputing global influence with the United States, and for that an aircraft carrier made sense. Today, Russia concentrates its distressing force in nuclear weapons, underwater submarines and missiles, cheaper means and, in Kremlin's view, more effective for the country's military objectives. A single vulnerable aircraft carrier, expensive and difficult to maintain, no longer fits this logic. In addition, there is the symbolic weight. Disable Kuznetsov is, for many veterans, a blow to Russian naval pride, as it means the definitive output of the select group of nations that have operating aircraft carrier. This club is restricted and includes countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and India. Russia, who inherited from the Soviet Union one of the largest military complexes in the world, would be withdrawing from this stage. But for others, the decision is pragmatic. Getting rid of Kuznetsov means releasing human and financial resources to areas where Russia can indeed compete with advantages such as submarine war. Maintaining nuclear attack submarines and ballistic missiles is absolute priority, as they ensure nuclear response capacity and can operate without the need for gigantic escort ships. The destination of the ship, although not yet officially confirmed, seems to be drawn: progressive disassembly and sale as a scrap. What will remain from it, possibly, will be some preserved pieces for museums and the memory of a project that symbolized both ambition and the limitations of the Soviet and Russian naval industry. Thus, a story that began with great promises, crossed decades of difficulties, and was attached to a hard reality. Admiral Kuznetsov, which should be the Russian naval force banner, ends his days as a floating monument to the contradictions of a country that tried to reconcile global ambition and economic limitations. From a symbol of a dream of projection of power, he becomes scrap, and with that Russia removes, perhaps for a long time, the ability to operate aircraft carrier. An era closes, and instead of black smoke that for years marked its profile on the horizon, will only remain the silence of a ship that, however problematic, represented an attempt to put Russia on the same level as the largest naval powers in the world.